Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this ongoing conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to a Tuesday edition of the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. I am Bill O'Brien, and again, it is a pleasure to be with you on this, the Tuesday edition, 23rd day of September in the year 2014. As you know, on Tuesdays, this is our, we start 30 minutes late. It is 1:30 in the East, so rather than our regular 2-hour stint together, today, on Tuesday, we have reduced it to an hour and a half. And so what that means for me, the planning on programs, I thought, well, you know, that leaves, we got a half an hour and then we take a short break. And I don't usually take the full 5-minute break on Tuesdays because we really don't need it. But on the Mondays and Wednesdays when we do our full 2-hour thing, after a full hour, it seems to me all of us need a break. And enjoy a break, relish a break, get renewed during a break. And when you get into your retirement years, you need a break, if you know what I mean. So anyway, we'll take a short break at the top of the hour, but it will not be necessarily as long as it is in our regular programs. Again, I want to welcome you to today's program. It is a pleasure to be with you. I do not say that lightly. I respect your willingness to give a portion of your time to us here at the Virtual Center. I just will do everything I can to make your investment of time worth the investment. That's kind of what spurs me on during each program. And a couple of the programs that I've missed, very honestly, I have missed because I didn't feel that I could, given what might be going on in and around me at that particular time, I didn't feel that I could provide programming worthy of your time. And if I don't, I won't. And so on a couple of occasions, I've had to beg off at the last minute and beg Bob Kincaid's indulgence. And he's very, very understanding and appreciative. But again, I welcome you. I'd love to have your input and hear from you. Our listeners, our other listeners, would love to hear from you as well. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, I would love to hear from you. My email address, waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. Before we get into anything new today, and today it's a little bit of a, I envision it to be a little bit of a hodgepodge. There are 2 or 3 different issues, and that I don't want to let linger any longer, but I do feel the need to address. One of them is a book review. I think I mentioned this yesterday because I thought we might get into this yesterday, but as I believe I mentioned during yesterday's program at the top of the second hour, an introduction to the program that I feel is going to take 10 or 15 minutes took a full hour yesterday, and I never got to the book review. So it still sits here, and I don't want to misplace it, lose it, or overlook it, because I think it is excellent. It is a review on a new book on the history of the Republican Party. I can hear all of those channels changing, and everybody's saying the history of the Republican Party. It's a book that came out by a historian who teaches at Boston College, and let me do her justice by giving you her name, Heather Cox Richardson. She teaches history at Boston College, and she has written this book on the history of the Republican Party entitled To Make Men Free, A History of the Republican Party. It's due to come out at any time, and there was an essay in last Sunday's in Sunday's Washington Post by her, which was kind of a synopsis of the book, and I thought the synopsis was superb. This is one of those books that is on my, I think this might be a good read list. And again, if nothing else, the synopsis itself provides a very valuable and incredible overlook on an institution, namely the emergence of and development of the Republican Party within American politics, which, as you know, began today's Republican Party began, as you know, in the 1850s in response to Southern intransigence over the issue of slavery. And of course, it achieved its first national success in 1860 in the election of Abraham Lincoln. And of course, as we know, the Republican Party has remained with us as one of our two major parties since that time. So basically, we're looking at an institution that has spanned more than a century and a half of American history. And so therefore, there's an awful lot of history contained within its own history, within its evolution. And what Professor Richardson, her name is Heather Cox Richardson, what Professor Richardson has been able to do with this synopsis is to provide an intriguing summary, which I believe provides a way to synthesize many of the principal political events during that period around the history of the Republican Party that she's focusing on, which I think is invaluable and raises both, substantive insights. It provides us in very, I think, significant information, not new information necessarily, but ways of looking at issues that we're very familiar with, that we haven't thought about looking at that way before. So I think it'll be very valuable. That's one of the things I'd like to get to in our second hour. But if I may, I'd like to begin with one reference, if you will, to the program that we did yesterday. Yesterday, if you remember, we were talking about the issue of pluralism. We started with the discussion of an article by an article in Sunday's New York Times on the issue of pluralism, and by Tom Friedman. And then we looked at the Harvard University site, specifically at the Pluralism Project at Harvard University, which was begun early in this century by Diana Eck, E-C-K. And off that website, I had pulled some of the things that the director of the proposal of the project had put together on pluralism and why it was significant. And I felt that it was a very worthwhile topic here at the Virtual Center, because basically it raises serious questions about the ingredients necessary in order for governance to be successful. And specifically, it points to the challenges of maintaining and building a sense of community within an ever-changing, evolving political society, if you will. And in order to do it successfully, in order to maintain community successfully, which in effect means constantly readjusting the process of building civility within society in such a way that as new groups emerge and appear as outliers who are looking for legitimacy and entry into the mainstream of the political system, the life of the system itself depends on its ability to adapt to these kinds of changing circumstances. Its ability to remain flexible enough to always be inclusive and to find ways to include these outside groups, if you were, which, if left outside and not allowed to participate and to belong in the mainstream of the political process would become threats to that very political process. In other words, if you belong to a group, any group, that seeks change, you can either choose to pursue it within the system legally, or if barred from that opportunity, you can pursue it externally as a radical alternative by attacking the existing system. Obviously, the ability of the system to be flexible enough to accommodate and to adapt to these kinds of situations is absolutely vital for keeping the Republic alive. This was one of the messages, I think, that James Madison, in his 1829 journal entry supporting the expansion of the suffrage to the heads of household and the heads of families, was demonstrating for us. And Madison predicted in 1829 that with the demographic changes that this nation was facing, within 100 years, if we were not willing to remain flexible and to be adaptable to the dramatic demographic changes taking place in America and expected to take place in America in the coming century, then this republic would not survive. And it would fall victim to a political change which could fulfill the predictions of many of the members of the Constitutional Convention in 1787, namely that at some point in time the republic would disappear in favor of a monarchy in order to preserve internal stability in society. Or it could evolve into something much worse, and Madison mentioned specifically the idea of a military government. But there's no question that what Madison was saying to us is that the kind of demographic changes that the nation was facing in that period, that he saw the nation facing in the coming century, were the kinds of changes that were going to create turmoil and disorder within American society unless a political change was made in order to maintain order within society, or unless the republic could become adaptable enough to find a way to accommodate these demographic changes into the system. So to Madison, by dramatically expanding the right to vote in America, he felt that the republic would be making one of those necessary accommodations, and he was all for it. So in reality, the theme here was that you have a diverse society. You have a society comprised of a number of different groups, national groups, ethnic groups, racial groups, religious groups, economic groups, the major one being rich and poor. All of these things posing a threat to stability and security and order unless a way is found to accommodate these situations, these changing situations, into the body politic. The ideal, of course, is to maintain what we've called community, a sense of community, a society which is able to focus on those elements and those issues which bring people together, and is able to put issues which are divisive on the back burner. Consequently, as part of governance, the priority is to focus on the commonalities, on the common ground, as it were, and to de-emphasize the more divisive issues. In the colonial period, which is what we looked at yesterday, in the colonial period, looking at religious diversity as a potential threat to community, unless you move away from orthodoxy towards something that we call tolerance, towards something even more open and accommodating than that, which we have seen in American society as the separation of church and state. And of course, it's very interesting to note that James Madison himself, along with Thomas Jefferson, was principally responsible for instituting the idea of separation of church and state into American politics in the 1780s, even before the Constitution of the United States was a reality. In 1786, when they introduced in Virginia the bill for religious freedom within the state of Virginia. The model, I think, is Pennsylvania, is William Penn's Pennsylvania. Because Pennsylvania as a colony was confronted from the very beginning by the challenge of diversity. And the maintaining of political unity and stability within Pennsylvania was always a challenge because of the diversity that existed within that colony. Consequently, it becomes a very, very valuable model for the diverse nation which is created with independence in 1776, and for the political system to govern it, which is created in the 1770s with the Articles of Confederation, and then changed dramatically with the new Constitution at the end of the 1780s. One of the things that we did yesterday, and this is the one issue that I wanted to clarify before we moved on to something else, is a tendency that I have, and I know I was guilty of this yesterday, is to use the words pluralism and community interchangeably. But the more I thought about that at the end of the program, I began to realize that pluralism is really the strategy for preserving community. It's not the same thing. Pluralism is engaging diversity in such a way that you are able to make the kinds of accommodations necessary to preserve and strengthen a sense of community. And then at the end of the time yesterday, at the end of the program, it dawned on me that I spent the 2 hours talking about community off and on and never really focused on the essence and the elements of community. I made reference to John Winthrop's City Upon a Hill speech in 1630 as what I believe to be one of the best sources on the ingredients which make up community. But I didn't have that source at the ready, at my hand. And so one of the mental notes I made to myself was to get a hard copy of John Winthrop's City on a Hill speech and have it available for the beginning of today's program. Because I think, even though John Winthrop is talking about a religiously orthodox community, he's talking about a community in which everybody subscribes to the same religious doctrine. And we're talking about a society that is composed, for the most part, of diversity, of pluralism. But the key issue is that irrespective of those two extremes, the fact of the matter is, in order to govern, you've got to have community. If religion creates it, then you make it a priority. But if religion challenges it, you must push religious denominational diversity into the background and replace it with an emphasis on civility, on civic issues that tie community together. Those things that make a community a community. But the fact of the matter is, it doesn't matter what the circumstances are. Community as a concept doesn't change. And John Winthrop, I believe, does as good a job as anybody that I've seen historically in giving us a definition and an explanation of community that's hard to beat. It's complete, it's comprehensive, it's easy to get your arms around, it makes sense, and I think it's something that all of us can understand and can value. So with that, let me share with you John Winthrop's definition of the kind of community that he believes the future settlers in Boston will be creating, and what holds that, or what makes that community a reality. Winthrop says, now the only way to avoid this shipwreck and to provide for our posterity is to follow the counsel of Micah, to do justly, to love mercy, to walk humbly with our God. For this end, we must be knit together in this work as one man. We must entertain each other in brotherly affection. We must be willing to abridge ourselves of our superfluities for the supply of others' necessities. We must uphold a familiar commerce together in all meekness, gentleness, patience, and liberality. We must delight in each other, make others' conditions our own, rejoice together, mourn together, labor and suffer together, always having before our eyes our commission and community in the work, our community as members of the same body. So shall we keep the unity of the Spirit in the bond of peace. The Lord will be our God and delight to dwell among us as his own people, and will command a blessing upon us in all our ways, so that we shall see much more of his wisdom, power, goodness, and truth than formerly we have been acquainted with. We shall find that the God of Israel is among us, when 10 of us shall be able to resist 1,000 of our enemies, when he shall make us a praise and glory, that men shall say of succeeding plantations, the Lord make it like that of New England, for we must consider that we shall be as a city upon a hill. The eyes of all people are upon us. If you think about the ingredients of that message, what Winthrop is talking about is a community that is knit together in so many ways that it functions as if it was one man. In other words, community becomes living. It's organic. It adapts. It changes. It's able to meet every challenge and every responsibility. It's able to come to the aid of every individual member of that community. And its strength and its survival becomes so important to the people of that community that they quickly realize that their very existence as individuals is tied to the strength and the vitality of that community. When people feel that kind of a commitment to each other, irrespective of whatever differences they might have, irrespective of whether they're of the same religion, of the same ethnic group, or the same racial background, or whatever, as people, as human beings, they are all the same in the sense that they all have the same needs. They need love, they need affection, they need friends. They need to feel worthwhile. They need to feel that they are important. They need to feel that they matter. And they recognize as individuals that no matter what role you play in that community, it is an important one. And part of that role is convincing the people that you interact with that they matter. Not only knowing and believing that you are a vital cog in the strength and the vitality of your community, but so is everybody else that you come into contact with. And if everybody believes that and lives it, it becomes real. You enjoy, you share in people's happiness, you share their suffering when they are in pain. You know about what's going on in their lives because you care. They are willing to let you know these things because they know you care. And they care about you. And if the circumstances were reversed, they would be doing the same thing for you that you are trying to do for them. We called it in one of our earliest programs over a year ago, the ideal Gemeinschaft, the ideal community, a way of life in which interactions between people were genuine and they were real. For the most part, people's lives and interactions with other people are devoid of selfish agendas. You can trust what people tell you because they know that they genuinely care about you as you do about them. Consequently, they are willing to confide in you just as you are willing to confide in them. And the question I used to ask in classes I taught when I would deal with Ferdinand Tönnies and the ideas of Gemeinschaft, the ideal community, as opposed to society, the ideal society, Gesellschaft, is that, for example, in Gesellschaft, the first thing you look for is the private agenda. If somebody makes a proposal to you, your first reaction is not, how's this proposal going to help me? It's how is this offer of help to me going to help the person who made it? What is their agenda? What are they going to get out of this? In other words, there's an element of distrust and a recognition of self-interest that seems to pervade all social relationships in Gesellschaft. Gemeinschaft tends to be devoid of those kinds of considerations. There may be agendas, but they're never strong enough to override the commitment to community. Because people realize and know and genuinely believe and feel that if anything happened to weaken this community, the pain would be felt by every member in it. Because every member realizes that if that community ceased to exist, so also would they. It's the absolute extreme of the concept or the idea that man is a social animal and that man needs other people. It's a concept, as we know from quotations we've addressed here on the Virtual Center. It's a concept that captivated many of the political scholars and philosophers associated directly or indirectly with the founding. Jefferson wrestled with this. Jefferson wrestled with the fact that it didn't make sense to him that God would create a human being and not give that human being a conscience. That God would not instill within every one of us the ability to know right from wrong and good from bad, and to be able to distinguish between good choices and bad choices. And Jefferson even went so far to say that it's life, it's living in society that tends to corrupt and blur the purity and the sanctity, if you will, of conscience. Consequently, Jefferson believed that if you go to the plowman rather than the professor, a person who has not been taught strategies for rationalizing the bad into the good, the plowman who does everything from the gut, who follows his instincts, his human conscience as a human being, chances are, Jefferson said, you're going to get the right decision from that person more often and more consistently than you're going to get it from the professor, whose mind has been developed and filled with all sorts of strategies and sophisticated techniques to blur reality and to confuse the good and the bad, the just and the unjust, the beautiful and the ugly. It seems to me that John Winthrop has given us a definition of community which all of us can apply in any number of situations. Because as you play out again in your mind these examples of rejoicing together and working together and playing together and mourning together and suffering together, and the idea being that community must be as if it was one man. And of course, once you give it that organic flavor, that organic meaning, that is alive and it functions as if it was a living, functioning human being, you begin to realize that in order for a human being to function, it is dependent upon all its parts. It must have a brain, yes, but it must also have a heart. And it must also have legs. And it must also have hands and arms. And if the human body is devoid of any of those things, it becomes disabled. If community is in any way weakened and denied any of the things necessary for the organic function of community as if it were a living person, then it also becomes disabled. It seems to me, over the years, as I've thought about it, and I've tried to apply Winthrop's rationale or Winthrop's thinking to different situations, not only in the colonial period, but in the modern period. It seems to me that what that definition of community contributes to my understanding of the world around me has gone a long way toward helping me understand not only what's happened in some of the things that have happened in the past, but some of the things that are going on in the present. There is no doubt in my mind, as we went through the ingredients of Winthrop's community, the ingredients of what Ferdinand Tönnies called Gemeinschaft, we can begin to realize that we live in a world which is so devoid of so many of those ingredients. It is a world that is characterized not only by open warfare, but by distrust, by manipulation, by innuendo, by insincerity, by injustice. My faith, along with Jefferson's, is in humankind. I believe people are better than that. I believe that people have a conscience also. And I believe that when we run into people that it appears are devoid of conscience, we are most likely running into people who have found a way to not only put conscience on the back burner, but to take it off the table entirely. They have found a way to totally confuse and conflict the priorities of human nature and the priorities necessary for people being able to live and function together. Most of our emphasis has been on the republic, on living together within the political entity created by the Constitution of the United States, the idea of a pluribus unum. But it's very obvious that we live in a world which also must begin to identify and build upon and strengthen the ingredients of community on an international basis as well. As much trouble and as much concern as global challenges make for us, the challenges of the environment, the challenges of terrorism, the challenges of pollution, the challenges of inequity, of world poverty and disease. The fact of the matter is that the more we begin to recognize these as a worldwide problem, the more we are beginning to envision the ingredients of a worldwide community needed to address and resolve those problems. So the irony is, the definition of the ingredients which comprise the problem on a worldwide basis, when taken together, give us the answers as to how best we must proceed in order to address and hopefully at some point in time resolve those differences and those challenges. With that, we have gone well beyond the top of the hour. We're at almost 10 minutes after the hour. It is 8 minutes after 2 here in the East. Let's pause very quickly and just take 2 or 3 minute break. We'll come right back and we'll get into something else today here at the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. We're just going to take a short break. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you, Bob Kincaid. We're at 11 minutes after the hour, 11 minutes after 2 in the East on this, a Tuesday, a beautiful Tuesday in late September. It is the 23rd day of September, 2014. It is a pleasure. If you are just joining us here at the Virtual Center, we welcome you to today's program. We have about 50 minutes, a little bit less than that, left in our program today. If you're just joining us, welcome. If you've been with us through our first half hour, 40 minutes or so, we thank you for staying with us. It means a lot when you think about it. All you have to do is push a button and you've changed channels, so to speak. And so if you've been with us and you stayed with us, then that seems to indicate that we must be doing something that you believe is worthwhile. And again, that's so important. That's really what all of this is about. So I trust, I hope, that the fact that you are with us is because there is something in what we are doing that you find worthwhile and enriching. At least I hope so. and we here, not only at the Virtual Center, but the Head On Radio Network itself, in putting on this program. We are operating on the belief that there's something here worthwhile for all of us to know, think about, understand, and be able to discuss. And I appreciate your willingness to demonstrate by the fact that you are here that at least in some degree you agree with us. So thank you. Our phone number, and again, we would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address, if you'd like to communicate directly with me via email, is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. If you're just joining us, we spent the first half hour, 35 minutes of our program today, principally looking at the idea of community, and specifically going back to the year 1630, excuse me, and to the sermon of John Winthrop aboard the Arbella to the first Puritan settlers who were coming to Boston, to Massachusetts Bay in 1630. And he was basically defining for them the mission which brought them to the New World, the covenant or the mission that this group believed that they had with God. And part of that mission, part of that responsibility, was to create and preserve God's community. And the community, as Winthrop defined it and described it, included all of the things necessary to make community a community. That's what we focused on. Because in yesterday's program, we were talking about pluralism and the ability of government to promote the kind of programs and to de-emphasize issues designed to strengthen community. In other words, de-emphasize the issues which are going to weaken community and highlight those elements, those situations and contingencies which will help to strengthen community. Pluralism, or the ability to engage diversity, to confront head-on the things which potentially divide community and find ways to turn them into positives, really has as its end product, as its end objective, the creation of the kind of community that John Winthrop is talking about. A community which de-emphasizes differences between people and highlights the similarities and the commonalities that make community what it is. One more point here before we move into something else. And this is just something that has occurred to me. What we are talking about here, which is the efforts of government, of those responsible for making the decisions and making the rules and enforcing the rules under which a community exists, requires an ability to be able to look at concepts and issues and apply them to totally different and changing situations. In other words, the strategies necessary to fashion community the ingredients of pluralism, if you will, require an ability to know exactly what community requires and to be flexible and adaptable enough to envision and to foresee the kinds of strategies and the kinds of policies which are going to build community rather than weaken it. What we are talking about here is the ability to take information and apply it in totally different contexts, in totally different situations. Obviously, John Winthrop's definition of the ingredients of community will not apply in most situations, especially contemporary situations in today's world. But the principles and the essence of his description are the kinds of principles which are applicable to any kind of situation if adapted and tweaked in ways that will produce the necessary results. The point I'm trying to make here, excuse me, very quickly, is that what we are talking about here are the ingredients of a quality education. There's absolutely no question that these are the kinds of skills that we define as critical thinking skills. The ability to maneuver and to manipulate information and make it adaptable to different situations in order to apply knowledge. Knowledge for knowledge's sake is fine as far as it goes. But the value of knowledge is the ability to apply it, the ability to adapt it to different situations, and to recognize that even though the situation might be dramatically different, the principle itself offers solutions provided you can make the appropriate adaptabilities, the appropriate changes. This is the kind of skill that is missing in our K through 12 education systems. It's missing in our systems of higher education. By definition, our emphasis on standardized tests necessarily focuses on the information itself, not on the applications of that information. But the real value of education, the learning that is taking place, is demonstrated in the ability of individual students to see ways that facts, information, content can be adapted into different and more challenging situations. There's one other thing that I think our education system needs to take from this entire discussion, and that is the recognition of community and what it means as being organic. Just as Winthrop believed that a community must function as if it were one man, all of us must realize that that applies to every kind of community, including a working community. While we continue to educate and test individual students, the fact of the matter is the most important solutions to the greatest problems are not going to be found, in most cases, by one individual, but by a body of individuals functioning as a community. a body of researchers, a body of lab technicians, a body of technology experts, a group of geeks, if you will. But it's the ability of intelligent thinking people who all agree on the ingredients of a problem to mutually solve it that constitutes the most important aspects of a 21st century education. For the most part, we have not been successful in getting there. For the most part, we haven't even begun to see the fact that we need to get there. So I would suggest to you that this issue of community and what it means and how it functions and why those particular insights or pieces of information become important in today's world continue to be more and more important as we go on. I didn't want to let the issue of community pass without connecting it or relating it to the issue of K through 12 education. Because I think all of us recognize the article, Tom Friedman's article of this weekend, makes the point that one of the benefits of pluralism is innovation. Innovation happens when a group of thinking people who are all thinking in the same direction are able to pool their insights and pool their talents and come up with potential answers to difficult, complex problems. Unfortunately, one of the things you look at in history, which is really, I think, it's unavoidable to recognize, is that oftentimes we have made horrendous mistakes in what we've done, even though we've done it for the most noble reason of the reasons. I was just, before we went on the air today, I was attending a Rotary meeting, and we had a program there, and you're going to kind of think that I've gone off the deep end here, but the program that was being presented related specifically to golf. Ordinarily, that's enough to keep me home, to be honest. I don't play golf. In fact, for a long time, I facetiously, when people asked me if I played golf, I used to say very facetiously, I don't even like people who play golf. But the fact of the matter is I've grown up a little bit. Take me several generations, it's several decades to do that, but I have grown up some. But this particular program was on developing a golf course and a physical education facility in our community for challenged youngsters. Golf for youngsters in wheelchairs. Golf for youngsters who are blind. And tailoring a particular facility for this. It's a wonderful idea. Wonderful, wonderful idea. And it's getting a lot of very positive response from where it matters, like the professional golf associations. But in the course of the presentation, and this was just an innocent comment that the presenter made, he said it was really interesting because the initial inclination of those seeking to find a way to implement this proposal was to locate it in one of our major cities: Los Angeles, Chicago, New York, Boston, Charlotte, Miami, Austin, Texas, Houston, etc. One of the major metropolitan urban areas. And they made 3 or 4 stabs at it. And the fact of the matter is, it took about 3 or 4 failures to realize that in locating a facility like this in an inner city community which needed the economic development, which needed the influx of money and the creation of jobs, what you were doing was building a facility for a population that wasn't there. Because the reality of our society today is that in many of our inner city neighborhoods, most of the males, heads of family, are non-existent. Most of the families are headed by women. And in those cases where a single parent home is working with a disabled child, a wheelchair-bound child, the criticism of these women is that they don't work. The fact of the matter is, given the responsibilities they have, if they're legitimate parents, they can't work. But the fact of the matter is, it took 3 or 4 unsuccessful stabs at building this handicapped golf facility for handicapped youngsters in inner cities to realize that we were putting it, or they were putting it, in exactly the wrong places. They were putting it in places where there was nobody living who could take advantage of it. And once they reached that realization, they began to explore other options, and here they are in Appalachia. And they're building a facility which will be something that people can migrate to, can come to. So they're talking about dorms to put up parents, because these children come with parents. But the thinking is you don't want to put up the parents with the children because it needs to be independent. So what they're talking about is distinctive housing for parents and for the athletes themselves. It's a wonderful concept. But it's a concept that had to fail 3 or 4 times before people began to appreciate why it was failing. What I'm talking about is the kind of insight that could anticipate that issue before money was wasted, or misspent, if you will. That's an educational skill. It's an ability to think cognitively, to think reflectively. It's a skill that includes the ability to anticipate, to speculate, to think broadly enough and intuitively enough to recognize issues and concerns which aren't directly involved in the particular situation you're addressing, but indirectly and tangentially they are involved and they are important. And the quicker you see them, the quicker you'll avoid making the kinds of mistakes and misspending the kind of money that oftentimes becomes necessary. Those are the kinds of skills and the kinds of insights that our educational system must incorporate. So far, we are having a problem doing it, for the most part, for the masses. Education for the few, more often than not, has been able to deal with some of these things. But education for the many, at least up to this point in time, hasn't been that successful. With that, let me first of all tell you that we have turned the bottom of our second hour. It's 32 minutes after the hour. So we've got about 25, 26 minutes to go in our program today. And I have 3 things on my plate. And there's no way in the world we're going to get all 3 of them in 25 minutes. So the good news is, for me, that in preparing for tomorrow's program, I've already got to start. Because whatever we don't have time to do today, I'll pick up tomorrow. Seriously, I wanted to share with you, before getting into the issues that I mentioned at the outset of today's program, I wanted to share with you an experience that I had this morning. It was an email. And it was an email that I was expecting because it came from a student whom I don't know, but a colleague and close friend for many years emailed me yesterday and told me that I would be hearing from one of his students who was involved in a research project related to the Constitution. And he urged her to communicate with me because of the virtual center, thinking that I might be able to provide not the answers, not the solutions to the particular research issue that this student was engaged in, but that I might be able to suggest some sources or some directions or some considerations that would help her inform and refine more precisely the research topic that she was involved in. Anyway, bottom line is, when I woke up this morning and got on the computer early this morning with my coffee, lo and behold, there was the email that I was expecting. And so I read it. And let me share, I made up my mind when I read it that I was going to share it with you here at the Virtual Center. Because if you have been a regular listener and participant here at the Virtual Center, it's an email that you probably could have helped this student out with as well as me. The issue was that the issue under consideration was the constitutional implications of electronic eavesdropping by government on citizens, by employers on their employees. Specifically, whether this kind of electronic eavesdropping violated individual privacy. Obviously, this is a topic that really needs some refinement. And that's one of the reasons that assigning a research project like this is helpful, because it helps a student to develop the skills of being able to refine and define down a topic into something that becomes manageable. So all I was able to do, at least initially, was to be able to respond with a couple of general reactions to the topic and a couple of insights, and recommend to the student that these are things you might consider and reflect upon as you refine your topic. First of all, I told her, who was a female student, first of all, it's necessary to recognize that privacy as an individual right is not in the Constitution. But clearly, in the minds of many people, it is the constitutional right missing from the Constitution that most likely or most obviously belongs there. The second point I made is that there is serious philosophical objection to a constitutional focus on the issue of privacy, specifically from those on the right. I made mention specifically of Justices Scalia, Alito, Thomas, and Justice Roberts, Chief Justice Roberts, as being the conservative coalition frequently joined by Justice Kennedy to make up the 5-4 conservative majority in some of the court's major decisions. And I pointed out that one of the elements, or one of the issues which helps to define the priorities of this conservative majority, is the way they respond to the issue of privacy as if it were a constitutional right built into the Constitution of the United States, either internally within the document itself or as part of the amendments, the Bill of Rights added afterwards. And what I suggested is it's not there. But the most important thing to recognize is, from the way that this particular group of people interprets the Constitution, they are committed to making sure you know that that right is not there. And any efforts to add it or to act as if it were there, they immediately interpret as an example of judicial activism, as an effort to implement what their opponents, the liberals, refer to as the living Constitution. These people believe, the conservative bloc on the court believes, that the text of the Constitution itself is the principal basis on which to determine constitutionality. If the right of privacy is not written into the document, if it was not on the minds and in the pens of the founders, of the framers, it's not there. And any effort to add it, in their mind, constitutes judicial tampering, constitutes an extreme example of judicial activism, and provides them with ammunition that they can use to attack the idea of the living Constitution. All of that is information that a person doing research on the issue of privacy in the face of electronic eavesdropping, a surveillance, electronic surveillance, I guess is the proper term. All of these things are considerations that it seems to me this particular student would need to recognize and need to know. A third consideration, and to be honest with you, I kind of emphasize this because I thought this might be of particular value to the student. What I said was, it might be, I preface this by the fact that I don't know the answer to this, that she could probably do the research by going to Google. There may be a body of literature already assembled on this, I don't know. But it seems to me that a careful analysis of the long-range implications of electronic surveillance, in other words, not just what surveillance can do now, but rather what continued technological advance and development could do in the future in order to enhance surveillance. It might be possible to use the long-range implications of technology in the surveillance business as a justification for the inclusion of privacy as a constitutional right. In other words, you might be able to link the threats of electronic surveillance to the need for some sort of constitutional amendment to protect at least some of the elements of privacy, if indeed there are any left. What I had in mind when I said this was a couple of things in the news of late. One of them is the search going on in Charlottesville, Virginia, for the missing University of Virginia student who's been missing for 10 days. And the fact that they have on surveillance cameras identified the person whom they believe was the last person to see this missing girl before she went missing a week ago Saturday. The second thing that I thought about was the camera in the elevator which caught the infamous Ray Rice punch. And the explanation of a number of commentators who make the point Ray Rice should have known that in today's world there are cameras everywhere. No matter what you do and where you go, you're on video camera. There's a record of you. There's a film record of you somewhere by somebody. So, for example, in the marathon bombing in Boston last year, one of the first strategies the FBI undertook was to visit all of the businesses in the surrounding area where the bombs went off and collect the video camera evidences to see, by looking at these videos, whether they could pick up anything that was suspicious. And as we know, the fact of the matter is they were able to find the marathon bombers by looking at these hundreds and thousands of photos taken by video cameras in the neighborhood. So the fact of the matter is, if we're on camera, no matter where we are and what we do, it seems, then it raises serious questions. Is there anything left of what we think about when we use the word privacy? And if there is anything left, will there be, given the direction of technological advancement and development? Because there's no question, one of the goals of investigators is to so sophisticate the technology as to be able to anticipate events before they happen. If you can anticipate crime before it's committed and thereby have a chance of preventing it, you are doing the most logical thing on the road to crime fighting. But in the process, if you are going to anticipate crime, then you must, by definition, invade the privacy of the innocent as well as the guilty. In order to make the technology work, you must subject all citizens to the investigation, not just the guilty, because you don't know who the guilty are yet. So the logic of electronic eavesdropping is to eliminate privacy as a concept. It seems to me that a well-crafted, well-designed paper structured in such a way as to make that kind of an argument could become the justification for a carefully worded constitutional amendment specifically designed to identify the ingredients of privacy most important to individual and to community well-being, and thereby craft an amendment defining that right in such a way that the electronic surveillance development would not penetrate or infringe upon it. That was my thinking when I responded to the student's request for information this morning. And finally, the last thing that I mentioned in my response to the student is the Madison letter of August 1829, in which Madison projected population growth over the next century for the United States. And I pointed out to her that in that letter, Madison made the case for the adaptability and the flexibility of the Constitution. In effect, that James Madison himself had addressed the issue of the living Constitution and answered it for critics. In a sense, James Madison's 1829 journal entry arguing for adaptability of the Constitution as the only way to preserve the Republic was, in my mind, the best rebuttal to Antonin Scalia's idea of originalism and an emphasis on the text of the Constitution as the determining factor in constitutionality. I invited the student to stay in touch and to keep me posted as to what kinds of things and what kind of direction she has decided to go in her project. But I did want to suggest to her that the potential for such a project is rich because of the number of directions she can go in. She can look at the issue as an issue and do a very general, superficial job. Or she could take one aspect of the issue, like an examination of the implications of electronic technology on individual privacy as a psychological concept, a psychological reality, and what the elimination of all privacy would do to the individual psyche of those trying to function in a complex society like this one. One could use, for example, the book 1984, George Orwell's prediction of a world in which man's mind is controlled by and for the interests of Big Brother. One could get some good ideas, it seems to me, from George Orwell's book, 1984. The other thing, and I hadn't thought of this when I wrote the email this morning, but I thought of it after, and if I do hear from her again, I will make sure to make this connection, make this point. And that is that while there is no mention of privacy in the Constitution of the United States, there is the implication of adaptability in the Ninth Amendment to the Constitution. The Ninth Amendment to the Bill of Rights makes specific reference to the fact that the mention of the specific rights included in the Constitution and included within the Bill of Rights does not in and of itself close the book on the issue of individual rights. It makes the points that other rights in future times could be added. The implication of that is twofold. The first is that it implies very clearly that the thinking of the framers was in the direction of adaptability and change, not rigidity and strict construction. That's the first thing. I think for Justice Scalia, that's the most important thing for him to realize. But the second thing about the Ninth Amendment, which I think is important, is that by suggesting the possibility of additional amendments, additional rights in the future, the framers make very clear that the rights being identified in the Bill of Rights, in the Constitution, are not unalienable rights. They are not natural rights. They are not inherent rights given to man by the mere fact that he is alive, despite the efforts of conservatives to argue to the contrary. The fact of the matter is, it's very clear that the rights the Constitution is talking about are civic rights, civil rights. They are rights that exist to citizens in this republic as articulated and identified within the frame of government of that republic, which is the Constitution of the United States. And the implication in Amendment number 9 is that as circumstances change, so also might the rights change. That argument about Amendment number 9 has been, heretofore, the major challenge to the Scalia argument of originality and emphasis on constitutional text as a way to determine constitutionality. So I don't take any credit for that, because the emphasis on the Ninth Amendment has been prevalent for some time. But for this particular student, I want to make sure that she is aware that the Ninth Amendment seems tailor-made for the inclusion of privacy. But I would suggest that in order to make that a happening, in order to make that real, there's going to have to be a lot of work done on the definition of what constitutes privacy. Because many of the things that go into the general understanding of privacy no longer exist in today's world because of technological advancement and because of the nature of the world we live in. I don't think any of us for 1 second would support the idea that some sort of surveillance in today's world is not necessary. I think that would be a hard argument to make in today's world. The question is how much. And the question is, how far does surveillance go before it crosses a line and becomes outright violation of individual rights that ought not to be surrendered or tampered with by any constitutional system, by any government. It seems to me that the definition of privacy that comes out of a project like this needs to be a definition that takes its direction and its guidelines, if you will, its parameters, from what currently exists excuse me, I'm coughing off mic here. What currently exists in electronic surveillance, but also an effort to project into the future as to what the implications of electronic surveillance seem to be promising us. In other words, the direction that electronic surveillance is going and what it seems to project for the future. And the goal there would not be to minimize electronic surveillance. Rather, it would be an effort to try to define electronic surveillance in such a way that it doesn't infringe on the aspects of individual privacy that are the most important. And of course that necessitates identifying exactly what those most important elements are, and then inserting them into an amendment in such a way that electronic devices, whatever they might be in the future, are barred from infringing on these very, very precise particular areas. I think the challenge is a big one, but I think the challenge is an important one. I think the project is an important one. And I thought that our folks here at the Virtual Center would like to know about it, because I think everyone who's been with us for a period of time would have something to say about the particular response to this particular student. If you do have such a response, I invite you, when we get together tomorrow, to pick up the phone and call our number, our 304 number, and share your thinking with us. We are at the end of our program today on this Tuesday. I want to thank you for being with us. I want to encourage you to enjoy this beautiful fall day. But please be safe, because we would like you back with us here at the Virtual Center. I'm Bill O'Brien, and I thank you so much for tuning in today. Thank you, and be safe.